Today, we're going back to the spring of 1913, to a city on the edge of change, Atlanta, Georgia. This is the story of a 13-year-old factory worker who went to collect her pay on a Saturday morning and was later found murdered in the basement of the Atlanta Pencil Works, and the man whose life was destroyed by her death. His name was Daniel Hart, the superintendent of the factory, and his trial and lynching would expose deep tensions over class, race, religion, and justice in the American South. If you're new here, this is the kind of story that changes how you see justice, the kind that stays with you long after the final word. If you're not subscribed, you might not hear what happens next, and you'll be the one searching for this story later, wondering why you didn't just hit subscribe when you had the chance. For now, sit back and let's go to Atlanta in 1913. Clara Mayes was born in 1899 to a poor working-class family in a small neighborhood on the edge of Atlanta. Her father worked odd jobs, her mother took in laundry, and by the age of 13, Clara was already working long hours at the Atlanta Pencil Works, like many children in the city's growing factories. The factory was a noisy, crowded place, filled with the smell of wood shavings and the constant hum of machines. Girls like Clara spent their days standing at long tables, assembling pencils, sharpening leads, and packing boxes. The work was monotonous, the pay was low, and the foreman kept a close eye on the girls, especially the younger ones. Clara was small for her age, with dark hair and quiet eyes. She wasn't the kind to cause trouble, but she wasn't afraid to speak up when she felt something was wrong. Her parents had always told her to be careful, to keep her head down, and to come straight home after work. On Saturday, April 26, 1913, she planned to do just that, collect her pay and return to her family. Daniel Hart, the superintendent of the Atlanta Pencil Works, was a very different figure in Atlanta society. He had been born in the North, raised in a middle-class family, and educated at a technical college. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and ran the factory with a strict but fair hand. He had married Eleanor, a woman from a respectable Southern family, and they lived in a modest but comfortable home not far from the factory. To many, Hart represented the new industrial South, modern, efficient, and connected to the North. But to others, he was an outsider, a Northern man in a deeply traditional Southern city, where old values still held strong. He didn't drink heavily, didn't join the local clubs, and kept his distance from the rougher side of factory life. That made him respected by some, but distrusted by others. The Atlanta Pencil Works itself was a symbol of the city's rapid growth. It employed dozens of workers, many of them young women and girls like Clara Mayes. The factory was a place of opportunity for some, but also of danger, long hours, low pay, and the ever-present risk of injury. Rumors circulated about factory owners and young female workers, about favors asked and promises broken, but nothing had ever come to light. By the spring of 1913, Atlanta was a city on edge. The Old South was fading, and the New South was rising with factories, railroads, and a growing middle class. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered over class, race, and the role of outsiders in Southern life. When a child's body was found in a factory basement, those tensions would explode. Saturday, April 26, 1913, began like any other spring day in Atlanta. The sun rose over the city, and workers made their way to factories, shops, and offices. At the Atlanta Pencil Works, the machines started up, and the girls took their places at the long tables. Clara Mayes arrived at the factory around noon. She had come to collect her weekly pay, as she did every Saturday. She was seen entering the building by several workers, and later she was seen near the office, where the superintendent, Daniel Hart, kept his records. What happened next is known only in fragments. Witnesses would later say that Clara went into Hart's office for a few minutes. She had asked for a small raise, or so it was rumored, and Hart had told her he would think about it. Some said he seemed impatient. Others said he was polite but distant. After that, Clara was not seen leaving the building. By Sunday morning, concern grew when Clara did not return home. Her parents went to the factory, but the building was locked. Workers returned later that day, and a search began. In the dim light of the basement, they found her body. She had been strangled, and there were signs of a violent struggle. Blood was on the floor, and her clothing was disturbed. The discovery shocked the city. Police officers secured the scene and began questioning employees. Suspicion quickly fell on Daniel Hart, the last known person to see Clara alive. He had been in the factory that day, and he had been the one to lock up. When questioned, he said he had seen Clara briefly, but that she had left the office and he had not seen her again. He said he had locked the building and gone home as usual. But the police were not satisfied. The factory janitor, Silas Boone, gave several conflicting accounts of what he had seen and done that day. At first, he claimed he had been elsewhere. Later, he said that Hart had ordered him to write 2 notes and help move Clara's body to the basement. The notes, found near the body, were crude and misspelled, and their authorship became a central point of debate. The prosecution would later argue that Hart had written them to mislead the investigation. The defense would argue that Boone had written them himself, to cover his own guilt. By the end of that weekend, the city was gripped by shock and by the first whispers that the superintendent, Daniel Hart, had something to hide. If you're listening to this story and you're not subscribed, ask yourself, do you really want to miss what happens next? Because what follows the investigation, the inquest, the rising anger in Atlanta, is the part that changes everything. And if you walk away now, you'll be the one in the comments later asking, where did this story go? The investigation into Clara May's murder moved quickly, under intense public pressure. The Atlanta police focused on Hart and Boone, interviewing workers, neighbors, and anyone who had seen Clara on that Saturday. Silas Boone, the janitor, was a man with a troubled past. He had served time for theft and had a reputation for drinking and violence. At first, he denied knowing anything about the murder. But, under questioning, his story changed. He claimed that Hart had called him into the office after Clara left, that Hart had strangled her in a fit of rage, and that he had been forced to help move the body and write the notes. The police found the notes near Clara's body. One read, "He said he would not give me my pay, and he struck me, and I fell, and he struck me again, and I am dead." The other was even more cryptic, blaming an unnamed man and warning that he will hang for this. The prosecution argued that these notes were written by Hart, then given to Boone to place near the body. The defense argued that Boone had written them himself, either to cover his own crime or to frame Hart. Meanwhile, the press in Atlanta seized on the story, publishing sensational headlines that played on fears of Northern men and young Southern girls. Cartoons depicted Hart as a cold, calculating figure, while Clara was portrayed as an innocent victim of industrial greed. Public anger grew rapidly. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, demanding justice. Hart was arrested and charged with the murder of Clara Mays. At the inquest, witnesses described the scene in the basement and the condition of the body. The doctor who examined Clara testified that she had died from strangulation, with signs of a struggle. Workers described seeing her enter the factory, but not leave. Boone repeated his claim that Hart had forced him to help cover up the crime. The jury concluded that Clara Mays had been murdered and that Daniel Hart was the man responsible. The case was now set for trial, and the city waited for the verdict. The trial began in July 1913 in a packed courtroom. Reporters from across the country covered every detail. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the testimony of Silas Boone, who claimed that Hart had killed Clara and forced him to help cover it up. Boone described a scene in Hart's office. Clara arguing about her pay, Hart losing his temper, striking her, then strangling her. He said Hart had then ordered him to help move the body to the basement and to write the notes. The prosecution also presented circumstantial evidence: Hart's behavior on the day of the murder, the layout of the factory, and the disputed notes. They argued that Hart, as superintendent, had both the opportunity and the motive, a moment of rage over a small sum of money. The defense argued that Boone was the real killer and that Hart was being scapegoated because of his northern background and his position as an outsider. They pointed to inconsistencies in Boone's story and the lack of physical evidence linking Hart to the crime. They also warned that anti-Northern prejudice and mob pressure were influencing the jury. "This is not a trial," the lead defense attorney said. "This is a lynching in advance, dressed up as justice." Witness after witness took the stand. Clara's mother, broken and angry, described her daughter's last days. A factory girl who had seen Clara enter Hart's office testified that Hart had seemed impatient but not violent. The doctor who examined the body repeated his findings: strangulation, signs of a struggle, but no clear evidence of who had done it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found Daniel Hart guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The courtroom erupted, some cheered, others wept. In Atlanta, many saw the verdict as justice served. But outside the city, many questioned whether a fair trial had been possible in such a charged atmosphere. If you're still not subscribed, ask yourself, do you really want to miss what happens next? Because what follows the appeals, the commutation, the mob is the part that changes everything. And if you walk away now, you'll be the one in the comments later asking, where did this story go? Hart's legal team launched a series of appeals, arguing that the trial had been unfair and that the evidence was weak. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the contradictions in Boone's testimony, and the intense media pressure that had surrounded the case. The case drew national attention. Northern newspapers questioned whether a man could receive a fair trial in the South on charges like these. Civil rights groups and labor organizations demanded a new trial, arguing that Hart was being punished not for the crime, but for being an outsider in a deeply divided society. In 1915, after a thorough review, Georgia Governor John M. Slayton commuted Hart's sentence to life in prison. In a long, carefully reasoned statement, Slayton wrote that he believed Hart was innocent, that the evidence pointed more strongly to Boone, and that a grave injustice had been done. The decision sparked fury in Atlanta. Slayton was vilified in the press, his home was attacked, and calls for Hart's death grew louder. Editorial cartoons portrayed him as a traitor to the South, and public meetings demanded that Hart be hanged regardless of the governor's order. Hart was moved to a state prison, but the mob was already forming. If you're still not subscribed, ask yourself, do you really want to miss the final act of this story? Because what happens next, the night the mob breaks into the prison, is the moment that changes everything. And if you're not here for it, you'll be the one in the comments later saying, I wish I'd stayed. On the night of August 16th, 1915, A mob of prominent citizens, lawyers, businessmen, and even a former governor broke into the state prison in Milledgeville. They seized Daniel Hart, bound him, and drove him over 100 miles to a small town outside Atlanta. They hanged him from a tree in the early hours of August 17th. There was no trial, no jury, no appeal. Just a rope, a tree, and a crowd that watched in silence, then celebrated. No one was ever convicted for the lynching. The men who carried it out were never punished. In the years that followed, the case of Daniel Hart became a symbol of mob rule, of the failure of Southern justice, and of the way fear and prejudice can destroy a man's life. If you're listening to this story and you're not subscribed, ask yourself, do you really want to miss the legacy of this case? Because what comes next, how this story echoes through the decades, how it shapes civil rights, how it haunts a city, is the part that stays with you. And if you walk away now, you'll be the one in the comments later asking, why didn't I keep watching? The case of Daniel Hart is more than just a murder trial. It's a story about prejudice, mob rule, and the fragility of justice in a divided society. In the years that followed, the case helped fuel the revival of the Ku Klux Klan and led to the founding of a civil rights group that fought for factory workers and due process. Historians and investigators later concluded that Silas Boone was almost certainly the killer and that Daniel Hart was innocent. In the 1980s, the state granted Hart a symbolic pardon, not on the grounds of innocence, but because he had been denied due process and because the state had failed to protect him. This story is too important to forget. If you're not subscribed, you'll be the one searching for it later, wondering why you didn't just hit subscribe when you had the chance. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have. If you're not subscribed, at least come into the comments and tell me why I read every reason, and I want to understand. And if you're still here, still listening, still thinking about this story, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Subscribe now, because the next case is already waiting, and you won't want to miss it. I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.